Amen. We're discussing the subject of parable teaching and how it's so pervasive throughout the scriptures. It's not just a methodology that we find in the ministry of Jesus. In fact, I'm saying the whole Bible itself really is a parable. When we think about parables, we looked at the definition and we saw that parable teaching was really bringing two things close to one another so that one would be used to explain the other. In its most simple form, the natural explains the spiritual. But we saw that there are some nuances about parables that are not at first obvious. So one of the things is that when we get these two battleships that come together, the reason that they're coming together is because they're not in agreement. They're in tension, so they're being forced together. But they must both follow the same rules, like the rules of war. We saw that the word itself, in the Greek, which was G3850, comes from another word, 3846, which is made up of two words, which means to throw something near to an existing object. So I gave another example that you have a cube, and the cube is what your target is. This would be the spiritual or the doctrine or the precept. And if you want to understand what that cube is, its nature, how it operates, you can't just look at it and describe it. It's not that straightforward. It's not easy to do. I gave a simple example. How tall are you? Are you tall or short? You can't know if someone's tall or short because by definition you have to compare it against something. And we're going to compare it to this ball. So a word that's used in connection with parables is this word juxtaposition. So I'm going to read again what juxtaposition is. If you juxtapose two contrasting objects, images or ideas, you place them together or you describe them together. So they could be literally put together. So you could put a BMW 5 Series next to a Vauxhall Astra and you'd quickly see the comparison between the two. I mean, they've both got four wheels and a steering wheel, but they're not the same thing, are they? You don't know how good one car is unless you do what?
Compare.
Unless you compare, unless you drive an Astra, not against those cars, unless you drive one, you won't know how good a BMW is. In fact, if all you drove was, you know, a 15-year-old Clio, you'd think, actually this car's pretty good. It's not too bad, gets me from A to B, quite comfortable, until you get into, you know, a modern day 5 Series, then you realise how bad your car is. So it's through this idea of comparison that you get a true idea of the very nature of something that's spiritual. The technique used most often is to juxtapose things for dramatic effect. So you take a really bad car and you put it next to a really good car. You know, there's no point in putting a Mercedes next to a BMW because then it just becomes a subject of preference because they're both equally good. You can't really contrast the two. So this idea of compare and contrast is to take two things that are identical. Remember, the boats are the same, but they're poles apart, if you like. They're very, very different from one another. It has these characteristics. And so the next definition that we had, juxtaposition is placing two elements or words side by side and letting the reader or viewer compare them. This act compares and contrasts the two elements and can show irony, humour or sadness. So that's the backdrop of how you're going to portray this thing, either through irony, humour or sadness. But it's to compare and contrast. And so we picked up this idea. Didn't give you any secular examples, so I'll give you some now. Beauty and the Beast. Yes, exactly. So I got beauty and ugliness. Belief and unbelief. We wouldn't say unbelief because you just put the un on belief, obviously. So another word would be denial. Bigotry, tolerance, calm, chaos, civilization, wildness, dark, light, despair, hope, fact, fiction, foolishness, seriousness, good, bad, hot, cold, leader, follower, poverty, wealth, success, failure. So you may not have, we all know those. That is what juxtaposition is. That is parables at its most simple and basic level. So, by the way, this concept of juxtapositioning is not just something that is used in scripture. All competent authors, they're famous authors, they all use that. Sister Emma?
In the previous lesson you said something about it unlocking power when you use this method, and I think we didn't get the definition of pithy right, and it's quite interesting definition. It means containing concentrated force, forcible, energetic, and pith, the root word, is strength or force or energy, weight, matter, of weight, moment or importance. So it gives us its power. When we unlock those verses like that, it leads us all over the place, and I think it's an important definition to put in there, that it's that it opens up a huge amount of doors when you use that method. It's powerful, and maybe we can link it to light and power of the third angel. You know, this kind of,
I don't know if you remember when we looked at the words in the Hebrew, the word parable came from another word, and what was that secondary word, the one that it came from? It meant to rule. I don't know if you remember, it said to rule, or to have dominion, or to have power. So this idea of pithiness is this idea that parables give you this ability to have this power. Pithy. Is that right? Yeah. Pithy. I don't normally like to do secular work in a prophetic study, but I want to give you an example. Famous passage. This is a novel by Dickens about the French Revolution, and it's the opening sentence of the book, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. This is the opening statement of Tale of Two Cities. It's about the French Revolution. And you can see him really, in a really nice way, using this methodology of comparing and contrasting these two cities. So then we went, we stopped there, and I want to give a couple of examples of how this compare and contrast we should be using in our everyday prophetic studies. So an obvious one, at least to me it seemed obvious, was Daniel 11 verse 41, one of our most famous passages, and right there in front of you, if you have never noticed, is the parable. It has all the characteristics of juxtapositioning, of comparing and contrasting two groups. And what I wanted us to see in that is that you don't have to go to dictionaries in some exhaustive fashion. You don't even need to go into other Bible verses. One of the things that, if you've heard studies that I've done in the past, is when we use Miller's rules to allow the Bible to define itself, or to draw in all the portions of Scripture, I think we actually do despite to that rule, because the primary place that we should be going to would be the verse itself. And I'm saying we've got into a really bad habit as teachers of prophecy in not remaining in the verse long enough and not meditating, contemplating that. And the reason we don't do that is because we're not au fait with using the rules that we're supposed to. We give lip service to Miller's rules. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that we ignore them, but I think we don't understand the breadth and the depth of how those rules are to be applied. Because we become compartmentalised in our thinking, say, tell me what rule number that is, without thinking of that in sort of like a seamless, fluid fashion, that we're using the rules in a way that perhaps we're not even aware of. So I gave an example, and the example that I'm using, this rule, it's not rule number X in his 14 rules, but this rule of compare and contrast is found in a number of his rules. If you were to look there, I'm saying this compare and contrast is parable teaching. It's this methodology that we're going to use. And so when we come to the verse, the thing for me that stands out, besides this being the son-in-law, which is where our focus normally is to say that there are two groups. And as soon as you see two groups in close proximity to one another, the first thing that you should do is to recognise this is a parable. The two things have come together. Then you can see, by comparing and contrasting the two groups, that there's this tension between them. They have these different experiences. And if we were to look at the word escape, and we've, as a movement, discussed the word, understand it relatively well, it's an idea that something's in your hand, and you're going to close your grip around this. As you close the grip around it, this thing is slippery, and you escape. So we take this idea to say, this escape, Edom and Ammon, is a symbol of those people who are under the grip or the control of the King of the North, the papacy, and as he tries to tighten his grip around them, they escape. He's always got his hands around them. So to explain it in a simple fashion, all of us know what we're talking about, is that these are people who are in the world, already captive and subject to him, who are going to escape. And as Brother Rayan pointed out, what does this prison house look like? What are they escaping out of? And he's rightly said, I think, that it's the maxims, the precepts, the doctrines of the papal church. They're going to come out of those doctrines into a new doctrine. But what we often think about when we say come out of her, we often think about it in the context of cities, like the tale of two cities, Babylon and Jerusalem, or churches. You come out of the world and come into the church. But it's much more sophisticated than that, I'm suggesting. But at this simple level, they're going to come out of one doctrine and they're going to go into a new doctrine. So what's this new doctrine that they're going to go into? What is the doctrine that they're coming out of and they're going into? I assume most of you would say at the most basic level, it's what? Sorry? The Sabbath. It would be the Sabbath, because this is the son-in-law issue. So they're going to come out of the first day and come into the seventh day. Once you see all of those characteristics and you're going to use compare and contrast, then we can allow the Bible to define itself of what overthrown means without even going back to the Hebrew word of what overthrown means or dictionary definition. You don't need to go to any other Bible verse. All you do is you just do this. Put an equal sign there. I'm not saying escape equals overthrow. What I am saying is they're direct opposites, and they're the experience of a group of people that are identical. The ships are identical, but the cube and the ball are different. So we're going to compare and contrast the two. And the first thing we need to see is they're talking about the same group. So once you start thinking about it in that way, you begin to realise that when we talk about this idea of first the church and then the world, we are not going to the world to save the world. The world are never going to be saved. And once you start realising the world is never going to be saved, then you begin to define what it means when you go to the church. So let me explain that in a slightly different way. I'll do that in a second. Let me just go back to this so we just tidy this one up. You're going to get these two groups, and you're going to say they've got identical characteristics, but there are subtle differences in their experience. In fact, they're opposites because they're juxtapositioned. Hot and cold. Escaping and overthrowing. So you know that overthrow is the opposite of escape. And escape means what? You're in prison and you come out of prison. So we can define that from the word. Therefore, overthrow means you're going to be what? You're going to go into prison. And what does prison look like? What does prison look like? Sister Cedric?
No liberty.
Sorry?
No freedom.
No. In this context.
False doctrines.
Sorry?
False doctrines. Oh,
Doctrines. It's the false doctrines. The primary one? Sunday. So these people are going to start keeping Sunday. These people are going to start keeping Sabbath. You can draw all of these truths without going out of the verse, without reading into the words anything. This is not a subject. It's not a study on what the Hebrew words mean. This is just using this rule, compare and contrast, and taking it to its nth degree. It's using it in the way that I think it should be used, the way we should have been using it in these verses. And this one as an example. So I was going to give an example and I've forgotten it now. I should have done it there and then. I can't remember where I was going to go with something. I said I was going to hold that. Let me finish that one.
Go to the world. Not in the
Oh yes, go to the world. That's it. Thank you. So when we go to the world is never ever going to receive a message. I don't think we have any information about that. And I'm going to go to the verse, Revelation 18 verse 4. Revelation 18 verse 4, who is the target audience?
church in the world.
It's the church that's in the world. Or, I don't want to call it the church that's in the world, I'll just call it God's people. So it's God's people that are in the world, they're the target audience. So if you can see that the dynamic, when we say, and we do this often, correctly, we may come back to this, we take the 2300-day prophecy. Sister Sophie, how long is this period? Sister Sheree?
490.
490. And the maths will tell you that this is 1810. So we say, this is the church and this is the world. Everybody familiar with that? No? That's straight out of Great Controversy. This is the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. 70 weeks are determined or cut off for God's people. So this is 457, 34 and 1844. So you know that, Sister Jo? Yep. So we say first the church then the world. What do we actually mean by that? What do we actually mean when we say first the church then the world? Because what's being brought to view are two different groups, two warships, the cube and the ball, and we're bringing them together to compare and contrast. So the first thing we know is whatever the dynamics are here, they must be here. We agree with that? How do we know? Because they both must follow the same rule. We're going to bring them together. Does the church look anything like the world? No. They're not in agreement. They're not the same. They're two different things. But they are the same thing. And when we bring them together, through this tension, we're going to see how this works. Throw near. Bring them together. So when we think about the world, I took you to Revelation 18 verse 4. I think it's relatively straightforward, relatively simple. What is that teaching us about the world? Where it says, come out of her, my people. How many groups do we have in the world? Two groups. So, I'll put the world here, and the two groups, God's people, and I'll just put Satan's, for want of a better expression. So if we're going to do parable teaching, what do you know that's in the church? Has to be identical. It has to be the same. So in the church, you're going to have these two groups, God's and Satan's. Now, if that seems too harsh to you, too difficult to swallow, then I would take you to Matthew chapter 3 or Luke chapter 3, where John stands up and says what to those priests that come and confront him.
Brood of vipers. The brood of vipers.
Brood of vipers. Anything else? It's because he's got tougher than that. Hmm?
The father of the devil. No,
It's the verse? So I go to Luke 3:7, it's virtually the same. Then he said to the multitude that came forth to be baptized, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? So when he says, you generation of vipers, again, generation is code word for children. Vipers, serpent. So you're the children of the serpent. And the serpent is Satan. So already you can see that John is using what methodology? He's using this clear methodology of parable teaching. He's lining us all up if we're prepared to see and understand how these principles are being employed by this group. By the way, when he says, you generation of vipers, what are they asking for? This is in the verse. To be baptized. It says multitude in there. But if you went to another passage, it's not the multitude. It's the leaders, those priests who come, who are seeking baptism. So he's going to do what? He's going to baptize one group, and the other group he won't do what? He won't baptize them. So one group can be baptized and one group won't be baptized. The people who are not baptized are the sons of Satan, the children of Satan. So Paul is already setting up this system that we see brought to view in the world. And we take that example, those rules that he's using, and we apply them in this movement, which is why we've, for the last 29 years, have basically been screaming at the church to say, the everlasting gospel first produces two groups of people using a three-step prophetic test, and then demonstrates what those two groups are. And those two groups are brought to view straight here in Matthew 3, Luke 3. You've got the two groups. Those who follow God, those who follow Satan. Those who follow God, those who follow Satan. Interestingly enough, when you come to the world, what are these people called? Come out of her, my people. He said, these are my people, these are not my people. We can see that right here in the church. There's a group of people in the church who are not his people. Paul develops this argument, you know, when he speaks about those who are not my people shall be my people. He takes that, I think it's from Amos. He takes it straight out of the Old Testament, that concept of those people who are not my people, that will become my people. Who in the Old Testament, sorry?
Hosea.
Oh, Hosea, sorry. Who is that group that he's been referring to in the Old Testament? Is it the Gentiles or the Jews? In the original context, it's the Jews. So those Jews who are not my people are now going to be considered to be my people. So you see that there is these two groups in the church. It's easy to demonstrate when you start using this methodology. And in the example that I've given, it's clear to see here from Revelation 18 that come out of her, my people. So if it's my people that are coming out, who are the others? They're the ones that are going to remain. They're the Babylonians, if you like, the people that are fully engaged in Satan's kingdom. So you had two groups who we would say in the world were part of Babylon. And if you're going to follow these rules correctly, you have to have the same dynamic in the church. Paul develops this argument in a powerful way in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 3, verse 9, what does he say? In Romans 3, verse 9.
Jews and Gentiles are the same.
He says, We have already demonstrated or proven in the last 2.5 chapters that we and they are all under sin. If you're under sin, who's your boss? Satan. It's right here. So when he says we are all under sin, is he talking about we himself? Paul? He's certainly not. He's not referring to himself when he says we. This is like a corporate we Jews. What he actually means is you Jews, not me Jew. Because later on he's going to call this group of people, he'll say things like, not all of Israel is Israel, or we're the circumcision and they're the concision. He has to even invent words for them, which is interesting because concision is not even a word, it's something that he invents. So he's always developing this argument that there's this compare and contrast. So the whole of the New Testament, the whole theme of the New Testament in this context is on one issue. There are two groups of people, one who are genuinely serving God and the other who are serving Satan. So we've got people who serve God and people who serve Satan. And if we're going to compare and contrast, they're all in the church. However we're going to define church. Church is a body of believers that have a common system of belief or a common way of operating. That's what I mean by church. In this church, in God's church, who's in that church in the New Testament? According to Paul. The Jews and the Gentiles. And who's in Satan's church or kingdom? The Jews and the Gentiles. It's compare and contrast. And all I'm suggesting is, when we start thinking about parable teaching and about the methodology of just approaching the scriptures, if we can see how this rule is being used layer upon layer, I could say wheel within wheels, it's everywhere. The Bible is replete with these patterns. And once you can see the patterns, sometimes, like in verse 41, it gives you the two groups. Straightforward to see. But sometimes it doesn't give you all the information of the two groups. And when it doesn't give you all the information of the two groups, or you're not sure about one group and what its dynamic looks like, if you know that we're doing a compare and contrast, church and the world, compare and contrast two churches, God's and Satan's, or two kingdoms, in Daniel 2, the most fundamental prophecy, do we have compare and contrast? Of course we do. This one looks like what? The statue. And this one is the mountain. Its most simple level is compare and contrast. Once you start seeing that, then you can begin to see why people in Daniel 2 make fundamental mistakes when they go to the feet and toes of iron and clay and try to tell you what? That clay is a symbol of whom? Of God's church. You can see, you don't have to do a word study on it, you don't have to define what brittle means, or miry. All of those things you can put to one side if you allow the rules of parable teaching, compare and contrast, juxtapositioning. If you allow those rules to do what they're supposed to do, they keep you on the straight and narrow path so you don't make mistakes. You don't need to understand all the intricacies of what those symbols mean and how you change the material. You know that this is Satan's kingdom and this is not. And whether it's got clay or iron, it's not a symbol or representation of God's people, because God's church is on this side and Satan's kingdom is on this side. And whether or not it's symbolized by iron, state, clay, church, this is not what we would understand God's church to be. The reason why people become confused about Daniel 2 is one example, is because they mix prophecy and history. And the reason why we can get tied up in that is because we teach in a very strong fashion that history is like his story, which is the story of prophecy, and we make the statement that history and prophecy doth agree. You've probably heard that statement before. But I'm not saying it doesn't, but the story is not as straightforward as we might like to think, because when you take history and you start tracking the creation and the existence of this clay that's here, which we might call the papacy, where did it come from historically? It came straight out of the church. This is church, God's church, Ephesus. Paul tells you the mystery of iniquity does already exist in the church of Ephesus. That's history. Prophetically, we're not going to argue that, are we? We're not going to argue that the Catholic Church, the papacy, came out of God's church somehow. Because we know that this is the subject of the daily. Hopefully, that whether it's paganism or papalism, papalism, all of that is the daily, the continual rebellion against God. So, historically, wherever the papacy came from, prophetically, God's church never gave birth to the papacy, prophetically speaking. What gave birth to the papacy? Or papalism? What gives birth to papalism? Has to have been paganism, if you're going to use that argument. And we'll say that papalism is just paganism dressed up in new clothes. The garb of Christianity. Those mitres that they wear, they're just Dagon fish hats. It's just paganism. So we know that at a simple level, prophecy and history agree, but we have to be careful how we deal with that, because when we come to Daniel 2, the history, because people use the history to tell you that the clay in the statue is a symbol of God's church that somehow got corrupted. God's church doesn't ever get corrupted, ever, never goes corrupted. It does some sin, it gets punished for it, gets purified, but it never corrupts itself, so that it becomes Satan's kingdom. I want us to think about those ideas. All of them are being based upon this idea that's on this board of compare and contrast. And I want us to see how, perhaps even unconsciously, we're using this methodology to develop these thoughts and ideas. But if we do it unconsciously, sometimes we can fall foul and make a mistake. And I'm trying to say, let's do it consciously. And the way you do that is by having your little book of rules, and you open a verse up and you say, how do I approach the verse? If you can't remember, you go to your book of rules and you say, this is a parable. I mean, the first rule is, remember this is a parable. So when you look at the verse, you think, oh yeah, it's a parable. Let me start treating it as such, carefully. Parable comes in all shapes and sizes, so they're not going to be straightforward to see. And often you don't get all the answers on a plate. They're not that straightforward. I've carefully cherry-picked some easy ones for us to see. But those easy ones that I gave you, they're not just random verses. I mean, Daniel 12:10 is not a random verse, is it? I mean, it's one of the most powerful verses that we use to describe our movement. Verse 41 is not an obscure verse. Isaiah 28, verses 10 and 13, they're not obscure verses that I'm picking, but all of them have the two groups right in front of your eyes when they're just pointed out to you. So, first of all, you need to see them. Then once you've seen them, you need to know how to deal with them. When you begin to know how to deal with them, you can start making progress in your decoding or explanation of the spiritual, or the doctrine, or the precept. So I gave an example here. When we say church and world, we're never talking about the world. The world is never going to be saved. The world is going to be destroyed. Our target audience is God's people that are in the world. Daniel 2. This is when you beat that statue, what comes out of that statue? The wheat. We know that. The chaff is blown away. This is the chaff. The wheat are saved and purified. Daniel 2. What comes out of the mountain? The stone. compare and contrast, the stone, the derelict mounted at the end, the leftover. You see this over and over again, compare and contrast. You don't need to be an expert scholar. You don't need to be an expert in the original languages. You don't need clever computers and to do all these word searches. All of these are helps, and I'm not saying we shouldn't use them, but these rules are simple that anybody can understand and grapple with. We're just not familiar with using them in this, I'll say, more comprehensive or sophisticated fashion. We're more used to saying a sheep and a shepherd and you and Jesus, and that's a nice children's story, and we put the parable to one side, and now let's get tucked into some proper serious prophetic study. That tends to be our approach, and I'm saying that approach is self-limiting at its best, damaging it midway, and if you're not careful you'll end up making mistakes. So you can approach verse 41 and you can come to some interesting but incorrect understandings of the overthrown group, because we really want to understand who that overthrown group is, how we actually define them. I'll give an example. Now, when we approach a Bible study, I'm saying we should approach it on 3 levels: easy, simple, medium and hard. And we should always try to teach that way. We should always try to teach at a simple level, and once people have grasped that, then you go to the medium, and then you go to the the details or the intricacies. So we have done that again without really understanding the implications of that, and that we're even doing that as a movement. At the simple level, overthrown. This is the SDA church. Escape. This is the world. Church and the world. Simple. But when you start thinking about it more, like here, at the medium level, then you start saying, actually, it's not that straightforward now. Who are escaping and who are overthrown? Because those who are escaping is not the world, it's who? It's God's people that are in the world. So if it's God's people in the world that are going to escape, who's going to be overthrown? See, my sister said SDA, and straight away she broke the rule there. She broke the rule there. Brother Tom?
Satan's people in the church.
Satan's people in the church. So I'm not saying he's right or wrong, but he's closer. So in this one, who's going to escape? This group? So even if, maybe without asking a question, when we approach this group, we should know it's one of these. At the very minimum, we should know it's one of them, not both of them. So this is not just the conglomeration of Adventism, just like this was not the conglomeration of the world. You might call this logic. And this is the problem that people who study the scriptures fall foul of. They're saying, you're just using logic here. I'm saying this is not logic. This is using the rules of biblical interpretation. This is proper Bible study, I'm saying, as it should be. But what we're so used to is saying, we're just going to do a word study. If the words aren't in the verse, we won't approach it. Or if Ellen White doesn't comment on it, she doesn't tell you who's overthrown, we can't speculate on who it is. And this is not the right approach that we're supposed to have. Hopefully we're all okay with that. So, the question is it this group that's going to be overthrown, or this group that's going to be overthrown? So, Brother Tom said it's this group, and I don't know if someone's going to say it's this group. But, and my point is not to study it out. My point is this: at the simple level, you can just call this Adventist. But when you start looking here, you know it can't be Adventist in that sort of generic title. It has to be something that's more sophisticated. The question is, who are we dealing with when we talk about overthrown and not overthrown? And this becomes quite a problematic question. Okay, I'm not going to get into it because we'll end up doing a full-blown study on that. But what I want to say is it becomes more problematic because then you have to argue or ask yourself the question, what is it? When you go to the word overthrown, we'll do it this way. Escape, what happened to these people who escaped? Where were they first? They were in prison and they break out. Yeah? Overthrown, compare and contrast, without even looking at definitions, I'm saying it must be the opposite. So these are free and they're going to be put into prison. If you're okay with that? So you have to ask yourself the question, who is free in God's church? What's your definition of being free or being captive in God's church? The answers that we would go down may be counterintuitive, may not be what you expect it to be. Hence my point is when you start taking these, what at first sight seem trivial, simple rules, and we say, let's get on to some serious Bible study, is that when we start approaching verse 41 just as an example, there's something that seems simple, at the simple level, Adventist in the world, that works. But when you start going to the next level, you begin to see it's not that straightforward to say this is just Adventism who's going to be overthrown. Because we have to ask ourselves the question, who is captive and who isn't? I'll give you one hint to this, because I don't want to, it's not my intention to study this out. Everybody here knows about the history of Christ in the New Testament, the 4 Gospels. And we know Daniel 9, the 490 years. Are we okay with that? If we went to a passage such as Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 and 6, Jesus tells his 12 disciples to not go to the Gentiles, but to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Or what we would say, go to the church. We'll make the argument, first the church, then the world. And when are they allowed to go to the world? After the 490 years. And I've marked the date here, AD 34. So here we are in AD 34. So if this was the time of the end, and this was 4 BC, and this was the time of the end, and it was 1989. I know we can apply these in varying ways, but I want to do it at a very simple level. If this is 34, I'm saying this would be the Sunday law. First the church, then the world. So here's the world, and here's the church. Now, what I don't want to do, because I want to try not to confuse us, is that when we do all this compare and contrast, we have to put layers on top of this. And one of the layers that we're going to put on top of this is the subject of the first and the last church. The first and the last church. So, the first and the last church, if I did the other way, the last and the first, maybe that would be an easier way of doing it, would be Laodicea and Ephesus. So often we put Laodicea as number 7 and Ephesus as number 1. But we do it the other way round normally. We say first comes Ephesus and Laodicea is the end. We're Laodicea and the New Testament church, the disciples, were Ephesus. But I'm not going to demonstrate that, it's not my purpose. You can show that the experience of God's church when Christ was here on earth was the experience of Laodicea. Give one simple illustration. Laodicea, one of the defining characteristics of Laodiceans is that they're blind. We're okay with that? If you go to Matthew 15, Jesus says, let the blind lead the blind, and if they do, they're both going to fall into a ditch. He says you're blind leaders of the blind. So just at that simple level, I'm saying the church in the time of Christ are Laodicean. They're blind, we're blind. Just take that parallelism. So you've got Laodicea and you've got Ephesus that is existing at the same time. They're both two churches living at the same time. Church within the church, if you like. Can we see that? Two churches here. We know that if you're a Laodicean, can you ever go to heaven? No. No Laodicean will ever go to heaven. You have to change your experience. You have to come out of the Laodicean experience and go into another one to be saved. You have to come out of the experience. So, if we're okay with that, adding the layer of Ephesus and Laodicea onto this story, Paul joins the church here in 34 on the road to Damascus, and he's going to be the premier person that's going to be identified as taking the gospel to the world. This is Colossians chapter 1 verse 23. Colossians 1:23. He says, the gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. So that's in this history here. So we've got Colossians 1:23. And who's the person who's doing that? I'm just going to say it's Paul. And Paul, remember when we said them and us? It was here. Oh no, it's here. God's system or God's kingdom and Satan's kingdom. Paul used to be here. He says, we're all under sin. Chapter 3. You go to chapter 7 and he says, I used to be in a really bad condition, but praise God I found Jesus. And he moves from this kingdom into this kingdom. Are we okay with that? So this kingdom here, I'm going to say, is Ephesus. So Paul joined the church of Ephesus. He gets baptized and he joins the church of Ephesus. So here, Ephesus is the church that's going to be giving the gospel message. Are we okay with that? The Laodiceans, what gospel do they give to the world? Besides making them twice the sons of Satan than they are themselves, Matthew 23. Besides doing that, what gospel are they giving to save people? They can't, can they? And John says, repent and be baptized. So, what do they need to repent of? Of their sinful condition. And all those people in Matthew 3:7, Luke 3:7, he says, I'm not going to baptize you. Where do they remain if you're not baptized? In whose kingdom are you? You're under sin. You're in Satan's kingdom. So, if you're in Satan's kingdom, are you free or are you in prison? You're already in prison. And if you never get baptized, do you ever escape out of prison?
Sometimes.
You do?
No.
If you ever get baptized?
If you never. No, if you never get baptized. If you never get baptized, can you ever escape?
No.
Can't escape. You're always in captivity. So when we start comparing and contrasting, this person, even though it doesn't say it in the verse, if you're going to compare and contrast, he was free. Who are the only people that were free? This group or this group? It's this one, isn't it? So those people who are free, what's going to happen to them over here? In the son-in-law history, verse 41. They're going to be overthrown. They're going to be put into prison. So the question is, who is it talking about really when you talk about this overthrown group? Because we just say Adventism, and I'm saying at level 1, simple, yes, for sure it is. But when you start digging deeper and go to the next layer down, you find that it's not just simple enough to say Adventism that are going to be overthrown. And when you start running through the logic, hopefully I put everything in place, you can come to your own conclusions on that, about who gets overthrown and who doesn't. I'm just using these rules to allow us to dig into that and to let those definitions come through themselves without me having to labour the point. Okay, so we went to Daniel 12:10, and in Daniel 12:10 we have an interesting dynamic. We're going to use the same rule But now when we become familiar with this rule, what we can do is we can substitute titles, or we can infer a title upon a group of people. Because often I think we would say, these wicked people, it's all you students that are lazy, all these people who don't want to study, all these people who don't do anything. I'm saying compare and contrast actually shows you that the wicked are false or bad teachers. Whatever makes you a false or a bad teacher, I'm not arguing. I'm not saying it's just your doctrines, maybe it's your character. Maybe you teach the truth, but you're just a really wicked person. You're unconverted. That might qualify that. I'm not defining what makes you wicked, what the definition of it, if it's just false doctrine or bad behaviour. You know, if you get the date wrong or if you lie. I'm not just defining that. That's not my purpose. But what I want to say is that they're teachers. And that is not intuitive by reading the verse. It just seems to be like good people, bad people. And I'm saying it's not just as simple as say good and bad. These are teachers of falsehood. Whatever that falsehood is, I'm not defining. And you can't define that from the verse that they're teachers. But when you use the rule of compare and contrast, it's self-defining. Hopefully we can see that. Then we got to Isaiah 28. So this is where we ended our last study. So in Isaiah 28, we go to Isaiah 28 primarily because of verse 10 and verse 13, because it picks up this really nice phrase that we all like, which is line upon line. And by the way, I'm sure we all know that line upon line really is parable teaching. And I took you to verse 9. Who shall he teach knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Then it'll read from the mill and drawn from the breast. There's two questions there, and then the answer to the question. So everything is fine with the two questions and the answer. No problem in that. Who's he going to teach, and who's he going to make to understand? So when we went to Daniel 12:1, I'm not saying the word wise means teacher, but if you just overlaid 12:10 with Isaiah 28:9, it says, teach knowledge and understand doctrine. So I'm saying it's the same group of people, teach knowledge, understand doctrine. So teaching and understanding. That's why I'm making this connection here. Those who understand, these are the teachers. We're okay with that? That's just conventional proof texting. Hopefully we're all familiar with that. The way the sentence reads, it says, to whom? Who shall I teach knowledge to? And who shall I make understand? All you folks. But the real answer is that it's those who have been weaned. That's how we would normally understand this. So I'm saying, who am I going to teach? Which one of you? All of you want to learn, but only the ones that have been weaned, the ones that are going to understand and have knowledge. I'm saying that's not correct reading of the verse. What the verse is teaching is, all of you want to learn something. How is that going to happen? The way it's going to happen is by God selecting someone to teach you. And the person that he's going to select has been weaned. That's the person that he's going to choose. The people that have been weaned are the teachers. Went to 1 Corinthians, went to Hebrews. We didn't read the passages there, but I alluded to this fact that if you're not weaned, if you're still drinking from the milk, you're a babe in Christ. And particularly in Corinthians, when he talks about a babe in Christ, a baby, the inference that he marks is that you're unconverted. A baby is unconverted. And he uses, you're, like he says, because your bad behaviour is obvious that you're unconverted. I have to treat you like you're a Gentile. Like this group here, if you like. You're in the church, but I have to treat you like a Gentile. I have to treat you like someone who's lost. to teach you the first principles. In Hebrews, he uses the same kind of tact, but the arguments are slightly different. He says, you're supposed to be teachers by now, but I have to treat you like you're unconverted people. You need to hurry up and get your act together. So that's one argument I'm using there. Then the grammar itself, in verse 9, there's this, the sign of the definite direct object, which is H853, which is before the word whom, that can be translated in slightly different ways. I think the King James translation is not the best the way it's written. So let me try and explain that in a sort of simpler way. The way it's translated here, I want to put the word in to. So if you just put the word to and then read the sentence, it says, to whom shall he teach knowledge? Which is what I said most of our position on this verse is. To whom shall I teach knowledge? To whom shall I make to understand doctrine? Then the answer is, those that are weaned. And I'm saying that is an illogical position to make that argument. It's not in agreement with other portions of Scripture. The better way to translate that, the correct way, is not with the word to, but with the word by. And it equally fits. It'd be down to the translator to decide which way he'd want to go. Should he be put in to or by? And if you are into comparing Bible versions, you'll see that there's a sort of fair mix between the two. It's either to whom or by whom. The proper translation should read by whom. So I want us to understand that. And I took you to a Bible version called Young's Literal Translation, and I just read it there. It said, by whom does he teach knowledge? By whom does he cause to understand? So I'm saying the grammar teaches by whom. That's the proper way to translate this passage. I went to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, Hebrews, to show you the argument about weaning and how that operates. And I want to give a third argument now. Now the third argument...
Excuse me, can you repeat the name of your Bible which you said?
That was Young's Literal Translation, YLT. So I'm going to give a third one, and this third one, perhaps to me, is the most important, because this is going to introduce us to another wheel in how we're supposed to understand how to use parables. I'm going to use another example, another book at a later, maybe tomorrow, of how this operates when we're going to go to the book of Joel. I'm going to go to the book of Joel, so I say that now so that you can remind me if I forget, of how we're going to use, how we're going to approach parables. What I want us to do is look at parables and give you some guidelines on how to approach a study of a book or a passage, so that you have something to go away with and say, okay, let me approach it this way. It's about how you approach things. So this one is we're going to take the historical setting and we're going to try and understand what that historical setting is so that we can understand the verse. And what we're doing here is I'm saying that Isaiah is talking to his own people in his own dispensation or his own generation. Now when I mean his own generation, I don't mean his grandchildren. I mean including his grandchildren. I don't just mean literally in his generation. I'm talking about the history that clusters around the book of Isaiah. Not literally just the people that were alive when he was there, and it doesn't go spill on to his children. So it could stretch into 100 years or 50 years past Isaiah. Does that make sense? No, because no one's agreeing with that. Okay, so let me explain it. I explained it in a convoluted fashion. Let me try and explain that in something that's more succinct. Now, I want to argue that God does not repeat himself without a reason. I think people use that idea. Now, when he repeats himself, it's for a purpose. If you go to the New Testament, sorry to bore people if they've heard this before, but I like these statistics. It's 27 books. And I'm saying every single one of those books, the backdrop of those books is all about captivity. It's 100% about captivity. And this is Roman captivity. And when you go to the Old Testament, which is these 39 books, it's around, depending on how you calculate, 60% of that book, 2/3 of the Old Testament, is about one subject. And that too is about the captivity. And this is the captivity by Babylon. So when I'm talking about Isaiah, and I say Isaiah's talking about his own generation, I don't mean the people who are literally alive when he's alive, because when he dies, is he talking about them? I'm saying, when I mean Isaiah, I'm talking about, Isaiah is talking about one subject. His whole book is about the captivity of God's people that's going to happen first with the Assyrians, I appreciate that, but basically the Babylonian captivity. So if I were to do a line that would look something like this, very similar to the line that Elder Jeff drew yesterday, so this would be the 120 that he drew, and this would be 977. I hope you remember that. Isaiah would be here. This is Isaiah. This would be 723. This would be 6. No, this is 5. Someone help me. 80 something?
7.
8.
46.
6. So I'll put 586, plus or minus a year. Isaiah's tucked here. This is Hosea, and this is Zedekiah. So this is Isaiah's ministry. And when I say Isaiah's writing for his own history, he's writing about this history here. If I were to do this in a very simple fashion, if I said this was the 70-year captivity, and then they're freed, and then you get 1, 2, 3 decrees here, then it's this history here. Maybe even we went past that. This is Isaiah's ministry. That's what he's referring to. The literal history that's happening in his generation. That's who he's referring to. I'm not suggesting that he doesn't write more for us. I understand that principle. I understand all these things were written for our admonition upon whom the end of the world have come. I get all of that. But I'm saying Isaiah writes to his own people. It's a literal history. And when we approach the verse, the story, we should always approach it from that perspective first. Why? Because first the natural leads you to the spiritual. So once we can appreciate that, if we went to verse 1, it talks about Ephraim. By the time you get to verse 14, it talks about Jerusalem. So in Isaiah 28, what I want us to see is it's Ephraim in verse 1 and Jerusalem or Judah in verse 14. So we know somewhere between verse 2 and verse 13 there's a transition from the target audience of Ephraim to the target audience of Jerusalem. Are we okay with that? Yeah? So somewhere here there's a break. So this is Ephraim and this is Jerusalem. We want to find the break. That's what we should be really interested in. But when we approach this verse, this chapter, so verse 1 talks about the fading glory of Ephraim, which is the city of Samaria. verse 2. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. There's a number of things we can pick up from there, but the most important word for me in all of that verse is as. So I'm saying that's the most important word in verse 2, as. Because as soon as you see the word as, what does that mean? It means compare and contrast, or parable. So you know that there's a parable being brought to view there. And when you have a parable, you're going to have the natural and the spiritual. They're going to follow the same law, the same rule. All of that now comes into play. So when it comes into play, if we went to the natural, then the spiritual, what would go on the natural in verse 2 that we just read? Brother Stephen?
The spiritual would be...
The natural. Tell me what is on the natural.
Well, that would be... Syria?
No, what the verse says. You're making application. So what I'm saying is, it's when you sort of press, it's easy to break the rules. We have to really think about actually what is the verse saying. How do these rules work? Because when we do it so seamlessly, we don't think about the steps. And I want us to think about the steps. Because when you start getting into thinking about the steps, it becomes a reflex action afterwards. And most of us are not using reflex action. What we're doing is regurgitation. And regurgitation can look like reflex, and it's not. What I mean by reflex is that you're trained through all the steps. So if you work in an ER room, emergency room, you know what you're doing because you practice it lots and lots of times. It's not just copying a nurse and not knowing what you're doing. I'm not saying you're doing that, but generally it's an observation that all of us generally are weak in. We regurgitated that this is Assyria without actually going through the steps of how we even would approach the problem. Brother Aaron?
The hell is
No.
Oh.
I'm going to say it's the strong one. That is the literal thing that's there. The strong and mighty one. What is the strong and mighty one? It's the storm. Okay, so now if we bring in Brother Stephen's argument, he's saying this is Assyria. Because if I said there's a strong one, you could point a finger and say, who's that strong one? It's that man over there. It's the real natural thing that you can see. It's been symbolised through this storm. So if we're okay with that, this overflowing storm, it describes it in different ways. It's a tempest of hail, destroying storm, a flood of mighty waters, overflowing and cast down to the earth. Now, if we wanted to think about this, I'm not going to do this, another important word would be overflow. So as soon as you start thinking about overflow, Sister Emma wants to swap this around. I can see her face looking at me.
What's the S spiritual?
Huh?
What's the S symbol? Spiritual.
Okay, if you want to do it the other way, I don't mind. So we take the word overflow and we bring it into where? If I said the word overflow, you did the word study and overflow. Which Bible verse would you go to? Go to Daniel 11, verse 14, yeah? So you'd see that this has to be a connection to Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. So we already know that, but I didn't want to go there. So once you can do that, then you could go to verse 3 the crown of pride, drunks of Ephraim, shall be trodden down underfoot. So who they're going to be trodden down underfoot by? The people in verse 2. And I'm going to skip down, and verse 4. So verse 4 is going to give another symbol of what this person's going to do. Talks about let me read it. As the hasty fruit before summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. So if you, again, did a word study on hasty fruit, what would that bring to you? Hasty fruit. So Brother Rain is saying unripe wheat. Yeah? If you check the word itself, it's not unripe, it's actually ripened fruit. And it's first fruit. So you'll find that Ephraim here is going to now be considered the first fruit. So you just go to first fruit, what does it take you to? Sorry? I didn't mean in that sense. I mean if you have a first fruit, then you have a harvest. So you've got basically harvest in 2 steps. So if Ephraim are the first fruit, then you know what? There's going to come a harvest. So if you compare and contrast, then you can begin to put together that if Ephraim is the first fruit, who would the harvest be? Jerusalem. And we know that because if you go to read past 14, if you go to verse 15, I'm going to cut into the verse. It says, when the overflowing scourge shall pass through. So the overflowing scourge is what we read in verse 2. And then if you drop to verse 17, it says, the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. So you've got hail, overflow, in verses 15 and 17, and it's all the same language as verse 2. We can make the connection there. So whatever's going to happen to Ephraim is going to happen to Jerusalem. And if Ephraim is the first fruit, Jerusalem is the harvest. So you know this punishment is going to come in 2 phases, first fruit and harvest. And we can take all of that dynamic in its literal sense, and then we should make application to that at the end of the world. So when this destruction happens, it's going to happen in 2 phases, the first fruit and then the main harvest. But in verse 2, who is the storm? Who's the storm in verse 2? It says, on the board. No, it's on the board. Without identifying the literal, I mean in the verse. It says the strong one, the mighty one. Are we okay with that? So if this is the strong and mighty one, for Ephraim, when you get to verse 15 and 17, if we're going to compare and contrast, who is that storm? Shout out, someone. Sister Shireen, you say?
That's the same story.
It's the same one. And that's the point I want us to see. That if it's a storm in verse 2, and it's identifying the strong and mighty one, so this was verse 2, when you get to verse 15 and 17, it says the same thing, the storm. It therefore must be who? It must also be the strong and the mighty one. So you know, without even knowing any history, that if I just put some additional information which isn't there, we call this the King of the North, then you know the King of the North is going to do a work for both groups of people, even without knowing the history. This is how powerful this technique is of compare and contrast. It allows you to interrogate the scriptures when you have missing pieces of information. You can fill in the gaps when you compare and contrast 2 different groups. But we didn't go here to make that point, because the point I want us to make is you get this group of people This is where you have to make the break, which I didn't want to really do. But you're going to get these Ephraimites here, and then the people in Jerusalem. So I'm not worried about who they are by the time we get to verses 9, 10, 11 and 12. That's not the point I want to make. But what I do want us to see is that they're about to be taught a lesson. Just so that we can see that. Ephraim, who is doing something wrong. The leaders in Jerusalem who are doing something wrong. Verse 1 and verse 14. They're going to be taught a lesson. And you can see that very clearly when you go from verses 14, 15 and 16. Because in 15, the scornful men who rule in Jerusalem, what are they saying? They say, we have made a covenant, we made a deal with death and hell, and we're in agreement when the overflowing scourge will pass through, it shan't come to us. When is the overflowing scourge going to pass through? When is it going to happen? When is that going to happen? Sorry?
Sunday.
We've got to work with the natural. I'm saying, sorry? I'm saying it's going to be here. The people who rule in Jerusalem, they know Ephraim's about to be destroyed. They can see it when they read the newspapers. They know it because the prophets have already told them it's about to happen. They say when this happens, it's not going to come where? It's not going to come to us. And their prophecy is, or their covenant is partially fulfilled because when it happens, it didn't come to them. But 46 years later, it does, doesn't it? In 677, when they come for the second time, then they begin this initiation, which we call the earnest of 677. And it's going to be fulfilled in 586 eventually. But when it first happens, they say it's not going to happen to us. So, from verse 15 and 16, they know that this thing is going to happen in the north and it's not going to touch them. But the storm that's going to come and touch them, is it the king of the north? Is it the same group of people? Yeah. It is. So these are all really easy examples for us to see because we know so much history that surrounds these passages that we can verify that these rules are working. That this idea of compare and contrast, even though if you read from verses 14, 17 and onwards, it won't tell you who the storm is that's going to attack and destroy Jerusalem. It doesn't tell you who that is. But the rules, compare and contrast, show you that it's going to be the strong and mighty one. So they're going to teach them a lesson. That's what I want us to see. You do wrong and we're going to teach you a lesson. So when we come to verse 9, it says, by whom shall he teach you knowledge? And by whom shall he make you to understand doctrine? Who's he going to use to do that? Who are going to be the people that are going to teach them this information? Historically, in the context of the passage. It's the king of the north. So you know that the way the verse is structured in its context is saying, you don't want to learn this way, so I'm going to teach you another way. And the people that I'm going to teach you is the king of the north. He's going to do that. We know that's the case because it says in verse 11, with a stammering lip and another tongue, he's going to speak to these people. He's going to speak to them in a foreign language. Now when we take these verses, we make applications to those verses, but in the original context, he's going to get someone who's going to teach them a lesson in a foreign language. The foreign language is the language of Chaldea. Or, we could argue, the language of punishment and pain. But really, it's the language of Chaldea. It's in another language, he's going to come and teach them and instruct them. So, I've given you 3 arguments to show you that verse 9 is talking about the teachers and not the students. First one is the grammar. Second one is proof texting. When Paul does it, he shows you those who are weaned are the teachers. Those who are not weaned are the students. Third proof is that contextually, the people who are going to teach are the punishers of both Ephraim and Jerusalem. By the way, in verse 9 and 11, it's not talking about Ephraim, it's talking about Jerusalem. He switched over here. It's before verse 9, the switch over to Jerusalem. Just wanted to make that point. And why is all that important? In closing, to me the reason it's important is because when you go to verse 7, in verse 7, there are two groups of people that are identified. Who are they? The priest and the prophet. If you go to the bottom of the verse, what are they doing wrong? What are prophets doing wrong? It says they're making mistakes in their visions. And the priests are doing what? Making mistakes in their judgment. So one group doesn't understand how to interpret law, they're not making fair judgments, and the other ones have got a wrong concept of vision. So they don't understand the visions. What visions don't they understand? The visions that are being spoken about in this history. The vision that Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. Not only Jerusalem's about to be destroyed, but this covenant of death that you have made here, before 723, that you think you're going to escape, this is a false vision. They're making mistakes in vision. So you've got this group of people that are making mistakes in vision and they're giving wrong judgments. So what is God going to do when he's got this? I'm going to cluster them together. One group, priests and prophets together. When you've got one group, what are you going to do? Compare and you're going to contrast. So he's going to compare and contrast with another group. And what is the other group going to do? What are they going to know? Two things they're going to know. Vision and judgment. They're going to make right judgment and right vision. And who did we say that is? That's the king of the north. Does the king of the north understand dark sentences? Daniel chapter 8, he does. He understands the vision. He's going to make the vision be fulfilled. Daniel chapter 11, he's going to fulfill the vision. And does he understand about right judgment? Of course he does. He's going to whip the people into shape, teach them that. But I want to make an application. The application that I want to make is not the literal, but the symbolic. So, if you've got one group, who are they? They're priests and prophets. And these people are making mistakes. They're wrong. So we're going to compare and contrast. So what must go over here? Priest and prophet. So when we make an application, who would we say the priests and the prophets are here? These are SDAs. This is, I'll say, Laodicea, the conference structure. Those people who have been ordained by God to teach us visions, to decode them for us, and to make right judgments. So when they've been drunk, I'm going to suggest with the wine of Babylon, what is God going to do in verse 9? He's going to raise up whom? Another group. He's going to raise up another group. Now, in our movement, we've been speaking a long time, as I said, a few years now, about priests. We're comfortable with the concept of us being priests because we've seen it so often now. I gave you the Bible passages that we could go back to. But we're still uncomfortable in this movement with the concept of us being what? Prophets. This idea of prophets sort of just sticks in the gullet and people are not happy with this idea of prophets. Like, do you think you're a prophet? I'm saying we have to be prophets. By definition we have to be, because when you use the rule of compare and contrast, if the priests and prophets here are going to be replaced by anyone, they have to be replaced by priests and prophets. These err in vision, these give bad judgment, these are going to have the right vision, they're going to have a correct understanding of the times in which they live, because that's all about prophecy. I make this point over and over again, people object to it, they don't make mistakes. How do we know that this movement doesn't make mistakes? Because what people do is they say, let me give you a whole list of all the mistakes that you folks have made. You keep on tripping up. I'm saying you can't approach the problem that way. It's a wrong approach. You have to approach it through prophecy using parables. One group do what? Verse 7. It says clearly they err. The replacement group, therefore, cannot err. They can't err because it's comparing and contrasting two groups of people. One go into prison, one come out of prison. They have to be the same, the equal, and direct opposites. They both have to be priests and prophets, but they're opposite in their experience. One errs and one doesn't. So however you want to look at this movement through your human eyesight and say, you guys make mistakes all the time, I'm saying prophecy, parables, teach that we don't make mistakes. And the reason we don't make mistakes is because we don't drink this wine that these people have drunk. So that's a third example, Isaiah 28, to show how compare and contrast work. I gave you an example from verse 41. You can see the two groups, easy to see, identifiable. When you come to Daniel 12:1, you can't see that the wicked are teachers. But the principle shows you that you can plug into that ... that they're teachers. It should be there. The rules teach that. Then we went to Isaiah 28. Isaiah 28, the storm in verse 15 and 17. Doesn't it tell you who the storm is? There's a blank space there. You fill it in. It has to be the strong and mighty one using this rule. You go to verse 9. Those people who are going to teach, they have to, filling in the ... the gap there, they have to be priests and prophets from the principle of compare and contrast. Therefore, I'm saying that we have the strongest prophetic arguments using this methodology to prove and to demonstrate that this movement does not err, it doesn't make mistakes, and whatever you may see or may not see with your human eyesight, that we're making mistakes all the time, and who do we think we are? We're just human beings, erring human beings. Scripture does not portray us in that fashion. And if you think, well, that's all the prophet stuff, because that's, toxic territory, the priest is even worse territory to go into. Because this priesthood that's being referred to in Isaiah 28 verse 7, what priesthood is that? What line is that? I don't mean like line upon line. It's the line of which priests? No, this is the line of Aaron. This is Aaron's priesthood that's in verse 7. So when Aaron's priesthood is going to, because they err, they make mistakes, did Caiaphas make enough mistakes to be thrown out of his job? He did. He's going to get replaced with another priest. And that other priest is Jesus. And when you do that, you have to do something clever. If you're God, you have to get the law and you have to do what with it? You have to tear it up. They have to do an annulling of the law. This is Hebrews 7. And Jesus becomes a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So this priesthood here is a priesthood after Melchizedek's order. Now when you do these line upon line, that means we are now of the order of Melchizedek, because who gave you a right to be a priest anyway? You don't have any, there's no legitimacy to doing that, because the only people who can are those in the conference structure who have their hands laid upon them and they go to university and get their degrees. That's the proper way to do it, the legal way. We've done it all illegally. So we have to rip up that law and create some new law that it's a DIY job, basically. And on what legitimacy do you become a priest? It tells you in Hebrews 7, without father, without mother, without pedigree or history, without a family tree, you have to stand on whose righteousness? On your own righteousness. Jesus stood on his own righteousness. Who did Melchizedek stand? Whose righteousness did he stand in? It wasn't Christ, it was his own. God one day said, I'm going to be a priest. And nobody opposed him. He became a priest of his own volition. He didn't say, well, who made you a priest? He didn't say, my dad. He said, I made myself a priest. What's your problem? Jesus does the same. This is what the order of the priesthood of Melchizedek is. If we want to argue about prophets and the mistakes we made, being a priest is a more toxic subject than the being a prophet is, when you see all the implications of what that means. If you're a priest after the order of Melchizedek, like Jesus was, who kills you? Who destroys you? You destroy yourself. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. As we contemplate the lines of prophecy, we want to ask that you would please bear with us and continue to guide and direct us. Lord, help us to understand from the simple to the hard. Help us, Lord, to become familiar with how to use these passages so that we might develop and grow into the mind of Christ. We ask and seek for all these blessings in the precious holy name of Jesus.